Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. The second half of our show, we're joined by philosopher, theologian, political scientist, and economics professor Jay Richards, who, along with his co-author Jonathan Witt, wrote an intriguing analysis of the famous Lord of the Rings trilogy titled The Hobbit Party, the vision of freedom that Tolkien got and the West forgot. Jay, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you.
Jay, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is probably one of the most well-known and beloved example of the fantasy genre and literature. I guess they've sold over 250 million copies. You wrote a book that is attempting to rescue the Tolkien literary legacy from the clutches of the cultural left. Why did you write that book, and why did you feel it needed rescuing?
Well, honestly, I mean, as you said, Tolkien is a beloved author. In many ways, he gave birth to the fantasy genre in the 20th century that's now, it's an exploding industry. Lots of people, even if they haven't read the books, most people in the, in the English-speaking world have seen his famous movies. Mm-hmm. If you read the Tolkien secondary literature, so these are the sort of books about Tolkien, what you find is ever since the 1950s, people on the left have been trying to claim him, his thinking, his legacy for their own causes. You'll get Marxist, radical environmentalists claiming Tolkien as one of their own. We're sort of lifelong Tolkien geeks. We grew up reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and so we loved him and loved his work. It's only later, as academics, that we realized, my word, people are misusing Tolkien. You can read his private letters and find out what he thought. And so we thought, somebody's got to do this. There are articles here and there that try to, but no one had done a full book-length treatment of Tolkien's political and economic thought to try to rescue him, as we thought was really deserving of such a great author. And finally, we said, look, we're really lame if we can't manage to do this before the third Hobbit movie comes out. So we just barely made it.
Well, I just finished it today. It was a very interesting way to look at books that I've read a couple of times and never really thought about more than just the story, because it's such a good story.
It is, and you can do that. I mean, of course, when I was reading it in the 6th and the 7th grade, I didn't see any of these things. I did start noticing it later. I have probably read the books, 6, 8 times, including listening to them on audio. But what's funny is that Tolkien himself tells us in his private correspondence what's going on in the books. And once you see it, it's obvious. I mean, let's just focus on Lord of the Rings for a second. At the beginning, there's a little section concerning hobbits, and he tells us, when he's talking about the Shire, he says, in those days, the Shire, where these hobbit characters live, where he starts, that in those days the Shire had hardly any government. Families mostly took care of their own affairs. You get this wonderful sort of bucolic vision of this agrarian society where people are, mostly managing their own affairs.
It sounds like Thomas Jefferson's dream come true.
Yeah, of course, nothing like this has really sort of existed in that pure form, but you definitely get the sort of vision of not a medieval English village, but a village in Victorian England when you've still got a little bit of technology. And so you've got this vision of small, limited government of people mostly minding their oon business. You get this epic tale of this quest and wars and all these things. And then you come to the end of The Lord of the Rings, this, 500,000 word long book. The hobbits return to their beloved Shire, and it's been overrun by the bad guys. And all interpreters say, look, this last sort of chapter near the end of the book is called The Scouring of the Shire. Yep. Everybody agrees this is a critique. Tolkien meant this as a critique of the post-World War II socialism, sort of soft socialism he saw in Great Britain, and the really strong socialism he saw in other parts of Europe. And so it's very hard, once you notice that, we begin with the beloved Shire with hardly any government at all. You end with the hobbits having to retrieve and rescue the Shire from these gatherers and sharers, socialists, essentially. And so, it's obvious that while this wasn't certainly a political allegory of the events of the time, Tolkien himself said they were applicable to the events of the time. And so once you see it, these things sort of jump out at you.
Give us a little background on Tolkien himself. Most people don't know much about him.
No, they don't. And he's a very interesting early and mid-20th century scholar, really, of English, of Old English and Anglo-Saxon literature. He was a professor for many years at Oxford University, and he studied really the details of Northern European language and Old English and all these things sort of led into what we now consider modern English language. And so when you read the books, what you discover is all these amazingly detailed names of people and place names. He actually wrote the books first by working on his sort of internal understanding of language. He wrote The Hobbit. It was really kind of a children's book. It came out in 1937.
Mm-hmm.
And then this epic that was sort of building on The Hobbit came out in the mid-1950s. And The Hobbit's really a different book because it really is, you could probably read it in the sixth grade.
It's
The Lord of the
setting,
Rings is an epic, and he's developed what in The Hobbit, this little ring was just basically a little invisibility ring that this Hobbit character Bilbo is able to put on and get away from bad guys and things like that. Over the years, though, as he developed the Lord of the Rings, the ring, when you get to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is actually a symbol of evil and power, in particular a symbol of the coercive power over the wills of others. And so it becomes this sort of symbolically powerful, really powerful force in the Lord of the Rings, and it allows Tolkien to explore all sorts of themes about freedom and liberty and life and death and good and evil. And this is why we're still talking about this book these many decades later.
Well, let's come back to that because I definitely want to get into the symbolism of the ring. But I also understand Tolkien was very influenced by his experience as a soldier in World War I.
Absolutely. In fact, he was served in the Battle of the Somme in France in the very sort of beginning of World War I. He was an infantryman, languished there really for 6 months in the trenches. And most Americans don't know about the Battle of the Somme because we weren't really involved in the war at that point. But the Allies and the Germans fought for 6 months in this one spot. Hundreds of thousands of people died. The end of the battle, the Allies had advanced 8 miles. So Tolkien experienced war really at its most brutal and its most futile. 2 of his 3 best friends died in that same battle. He got sick with trench fever and had to convalesce back in England. And so this really shaped his vision of what war's like. No one could accuse him of having a sort of romantic image of war, and yet in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it's been said that especially The Lord of the Rings is a war book. He kind of in some ways dignifies war. He doesn't elevate it, but he is quite clear that there are times and places and circumstances in which the just thing to do is to go to war. And in fact, the good guys in The Lord of the Rings really you could read them as reflecting on, okay, what makes a war just and what makes it unjust, and you see that. So, there's no doubt, especially a famous scene that anyone who has seen the movies will remember when Frodo and Sam, 2 hobbits plus another character, Gollum, go through the so-called dead marshes, vast marshlands in which battles had been fought thousands of years before, and they could see the sort of the ghosts, the images of these dead bodies under the water. Well, this was a reflection almost certainly of Tolkien's experience at the Battle of the Somme, which was so intense that for months, sort of the no man's land between the warring trenches were just adrift with bodies that were rotting, and that stuck in Tolkien's mind for a lifetime.
Could the events of World War II have really impacted his view of war, given the futility of World War I and yet the necessity of World War II?
I think so, because if it had just been World War I, he might have actually had a much dimmer view of the possible benefits of a just war, because, many people think, gosh, World War I, it didn't really accomplish anything, and it laid the seeds for World War II. World War II, though, we had some very clear good guys and bad guys, very much a just cause, though, of course, nothing in The Lord of the Rings, he insisted, was a sort of a direct symbol of World War II. People have tried to say, well, the ring is a symbol of the atomic bomb. He explicitly said, no, that just misses it all. It's not an allegory. But all of those things certainly were sort of fodder as he was working on the books. And so, he was working on these books, we know, really from the early 1940s all the way into the 1950s when The Lord of the Rings came out. And so sort of the most reputable Tolkien interpreters say, yes, absolutely. His experience, both of World War II and then what he saw happen in Great Britain after World War II, in which the country managed to win and then implemented a lot of the kind of soft, tyrannical policies that they'd gone to war to fight. It was just squandered. And so he really disliked this. And we know this because we've got his private letters and can find out what he actually thought.
So, Jay, let's return to the symbolism of the ring and the power that comes with it. It was offered several times to good characters in the book, like Gandalf and the Elven Queen, and they turned it down. What did that mean?
Well, the ring was made by this evil Lord Sauron in the distant past, and he sort of tied his existence to the ring. But he knew the ring would give him great power, but it also had the capacity for anyone else that wore it, that they would come under his power. And so it's sort of a thing that would be attractive, would be a great temptation, but would end up leading to someone's downfall. And so the really wise characters, they don't even want to so much as touch the ring.
They might not be corrupted by it.
Exactly. And we know that all the characters in the books, except for one that doesn't make it to the movies, become invisible when they wear the ring. So it gives them a sort of power. And in fact, the creature Gollum had the ring for hundreds of years, and he'd managed to live for over 500 years as a result of having the ring. It had also turned him into a weird, emaciated sort of creature. And so this is really Tolkien's reflection on the nature of evil. What's interesting, though, is that, there's this classical debate in Western theology and philosophy about the nature of evil. On one side, the argument is that, well, evil isn't a real thing. It's not like God created evil. What evil is it's a sort of shadow of things that exist. It's a drift into nothingness. It's not a real thing unto itself. But then that sounds a little weak. You experience evil quite directly if you get mugged by someone. So on the other side is that no, evil is a sort of a real thing. It has real active power. And Tolkien sort of combines both of these things in the ring. So yes, it's a temptation that people can fall under, but he talks about the ring wanting to be found, wanting to be lost, wanting to get back to its master. And so he combines all this amazing philosophical reflection over 2,000 years about the nature of evil into this weird sort of character of the ring. And then that transforms the story of the Lord of the Ring from the traditional narrative trope of a quest. Because, of course, in a quest, you have people, they go on a quest, they go on a trip,
right,
try to get something. Well, the quest in the Lord of the Rings is where the good characters actually have to figure out and decide, how do we get rid of this
how do we destroy
How do we rid the world of it? Yeah, and so he really turns the quest narrative on its head.
This exploration of evil is, of course, something that's deep in Catholic thought, and Tolkien was a devout Catholic. To what extent did those views color his writing?
Almost entirely. I mean, this is what's amusing about Tolkien's books, because if you read them, certainly the Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, there's no discussion of religion per se. But if you read this other sort of legendarium that he developed, the Silmarillion, it's clear that he had a very explicitly theistic view, that is, this view of a transcendent creator that created things, that was the source of good. And in his Catholic views, he told a priest friend, he said, in many ways, the book is a Catholic and religious book. It's just that his religious worldview is submerged so deeply that you don't see it on its surface. But anyone that has the sort of eyes to see will recognize it in his understanding of the ring. On one hand, evil is real. You've got real agents like Sauron and the ring wraiths and orcs that are active participants in evil, but nevertheless, they're not ultimate realities. We're told in the books that even at the beginning they were created good, but they fell of their own free will. And so Tolkien, only someone very, very sophisticated in philosophy and theology, only really kind of a serious Catholic that knew the tradition, could ever have written a story like this, because it's actually quite sophisticated. But of course, you can read the books and love them without even really knowing this background. Of
course. In your book, The Hobbit Party, I marked a line, and I can't remember whether you were quoting someone or this was your observation, that man without the threat of consequences is certainly to become most immoral. And we're talking about the invisibility of the ring and the impact that would have in people. And you compared that to the famous H.G. Wells' Invisible Man story in terms of the consequences. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, it's funny because, of course, Wells had done this. Wagner had used the ring. But this idea of a sort of ring of great consequence, it goes all the way back to Plato in his book, Plato's Republic, which there's this sort of myth described in Plato's Republic of a ring that's found, sort of discovered in a cave, and it gives you the ability, you put it on, and it makes you invisible, and so you can do whatever you want to do. He says that would be a horrible thing, because people, in fact, we sort of need consequences to our actions. It would be the very rare person that was so virtuous that even if he could wear a ring where he could never get caught, would nevertheless do the virtuous thing. And so Tolkien is tapping into this long tradition about, what happens if somebody can do something without consequence. And of course, when you find out what the ring's like in The Lord of the Rings, it turns out you can't do that. There is a consequence. Yeah, you might have great power. It might give you vision. It might make you invisible, but it's ultimately going to put you under the absolute control of this evil force.
Talk a little bit about the all-seeing eye.
The all-seeing eye in The Lord of the Rings is really Sauron, this evil character who has actually been killed in battle. Thousands of years before The Lord of the Rings starts, he was actually killed in battle. But he is actually, we learned by reading some of the other Tolkien literature, not an ordinary man. He's sort of an incarnate angel, very much like the wizards in the book. And so he has this kind of transcendent power. And because he's created this ring, his spirit is essentially tied to the ring, so that even though his body is destroyed, the ring is still out there, and so he's able to slowly, over thousands of years, rebuild his power. And so by the time the Lord of the Rings sort of comes about, he is this all-seeing eye, but not yet sort of fully embodied. But he has this capacity to gaze all across Middle-earth, to both control things, to get into people's minds, and to see what's going on. And this image, in some ways, what's funny is that in the Western tradition, sometimes the all-seeing eye is actually attributed to God, but Tolkien doesn't think that's a especially good image to think of God as sort of just staring at everybody lidlessly. So it becomes this really the image of, he's essentially, in Tolkien's legendary world, he's sort of essentially a servant of Satan who is able to oversee and to control and to dominate others according to his will. And so it's only at the end, when the ring is destroyed, that the light in the eye finally goes out and the tower he occupies collapses.
And what's the connection to the totalitarian state? There's been a lot of literature, of course, since then, 1984, Brave New World, that looks into those issues.
Absolutely, and Tolkien was aware of that. He was also aware of the so-called panopticon, which was actually a prison idea developed by the British utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And his idea is you'd have this sort of octagonal prison in which you have a tower in the middle with windows on all sides. And so you could have a single guard that could look out and look directly into anyone's prison cell. But the way it would be set up, the prisoner could never tell if they were being watched, so they'd have to assume they were being watched. There's just something creepy and ominous about that, and George Orwell really captured it in 1984, where everyone in every one of their apartments had not just a TV, but a two-way TV. So you're looking at Big Brother, and he's looking at you. Well, that's what the eye is doing, Sauron's eye, in The Lord of the Rings. And so once again, we get something that has these obvious political resonances.
Isn't that pretty much what it's like walking the streets of London today?
It actually is. In fact, London, I think I have read, has more cameras per square mile and more cameras per person than any place else in the world. And given the way technology is going, it's something not even Tolkien could have anticipated, but I think we can assume within 10 years that there'll be cameras on probably every open square inch of space in civilization. And this is something that, of course that can have some benefits if you're trying to track down a terrorist, but it also is quite scary if it gives the centralized state unlimited power.
So, Jay, throughout The Hobbit and to a certain extent in The Lord of the Rings as well, trade plays a major role. Remind us about that.
It does, and this is important because so many people have misunderstood Tolkien's understanding of economics. They might think he was a Luddite that hated technology and thought everything was supposed to be, like the Shire. It's important to remember the Shire is only one location. It's one little community in The Lord of the Rings. You've also got elves that live in the woods. You've got sort of highbrow elves that live in a beautiful forest. You've got dwarves living in caves, and you've got men living in towns and in great stone cities. And all of these play a part in Middle-earth. What's interesting when you come to the end of his first book, The Hobbit, you've got this image in which things have gone bad. So you've got men living in this town of Lake Town and dwarves and elves, and a dragon has taken control of all the sort of wealth and booty of these people and is hoarding it in this mountain to himself, and they want to get it back. It's messed up the kind of relationships between the dwarves and the elves and the men. At the end of The Hobbit, though, after the dragon is defeated, the booty has been set free, we get some skirmishes and even a war. What happens, and Tolkien describes, the sort of bounty that results, towns are rebuilt, you get opening up of trade between the men and the elves and the dwarves and even the occasional
the
hobbit.
capital gets invested instead of being
hoarded.
hoarded.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. And so we talk about international trade, but we're just talking about trade between ourselves. The good news at the end of The Hobbit, you get interspecies trade between these different characters, and they all end up better off as a result. And that's something people don't often notice about The Hobbit, that Tolkien actually had a beautiful vision for widespread trade.
Jay, I understand that after the Berlin Wall fell 25 years ago, signs began appearing that said Frodo is with us. What does that mean?
Frodo, of course, is the key character in The Lord of the Rings. He's this little hobbit. What's funny is that in East Germany and in the Soviet Union, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, Tolkien was banned. So the communists understood, look, this is not something we want people reading. And so a bad mimeograph copy, pirated copy, got sent around. And so the dissidents were reading The Lord of the Rings. As a result, when the wall came down in Berlin and things started happening in Red Square in Moscow, signs appeared that said Frodo is with us. They were using Frodo as the symbol of freedom from a sort of massive oppressive government. And, we reflect on that at the end of the book because it was beautiful. I mean, I'm getting cold chills just thinking about it because I remember when it happened. And yet we worry that, there are people voting now that don't even remember the Soviet Union or the Cold War. And so we turn the question around and say, instead of asking if Frodo is with us, we might want to ask, are we with Frodo?
On that question of are we with Frodo, one of the strange things about The Lord of the Rings, after the defeat of evil and the climax and the armies, the hobbits return and engage in what looks like a little post-cleanup activity, which is the scouring of the Shire. Remind us what Tolkien was trying to tell us with that.
Yeah, it's amazing. When you read the book, or if you've seen the movies, people often say it feels like it has about 3 endings, which it does. And the book has about 4 endings because the movies don't include the scouring of the Shire, which people often feel is kind of an anticlimax. It's after the war has been won. But Tolkien had a very important point here. He said, look, the kingdom of God is not consummated just because we've won a battle. And just because we've won one big battle doesn't mean there don't continue to be these battles that have to be fought. And so the effects of evil, even though in The Lord of the Rings, evil Lord Sauron has been defeated. He's been killed. His ally, confusingly named Sauron, is still around and wandering through Middle-earth. And so he gets some cronies and they take over the Shire, in part out of spite because they were mad at the hobbits for having defeated him. And when they appear, of course, you had this beautiful image of this green pastoral village of the Shire has now been, a lot of stuff's torn down. The party tree has been torn down. There's ugly smokestacks and people are gathering.
Like Eastern Europe after the communists took over.
Exactly like Eastern Europe, after the communists took over. And this is really Tolkien's point, is that, look, the effects of evil they don't just disappear because you've won a huge battle. Just because in the West, we defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War, it doesn't mean now suddenly, as Francis Fukuyama said, that it's the end of history, and milk and honey are going to flow in the streets. The effects of evil continue, and we have to be ever vigilant. And Tolkien, by putting this at the very end of the book, reminds us of that these battles, they go on for the rest of history until it's done, because good and evil flow through the middle of every human heart, and this is something, certainly in the political realm, that we have to always consider. One victory doesn't mean that we're not going to have to fight again tomorrow.
Which makes it so important to actually know our history.
Absolutely.
Jay, I have to tell you, I'm going to go back and read the Ring trilogy again, and I'll never look at it the same after reading your book. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Jay Richards, co-author of The Hobbit Party, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests, please visit realclearradio.org, click on the email Bill link, and drop me a line. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.